Hey guys, I'm Nathan from Arms and Armor. Today I want to keep talking about training tools for HEMA and sword fighting and what the different kinds of tools that we produce can teach us about sword fighting and what we have to keep in mind when we select a tool to train a particular kind of sword fighting system. So, this is a trainer that I briefly showed you guys on a previous video with Jess Finley. This is one that I made in collaboration with Jeff Forgang down at the Higgins Armory at the Worcester Art Museum, and Dale Utt, who is a fellow at the Oakeshott Institute and works at the Cleveland Museum and does 3D modeling. So this is a close replica of a 16th century training longsword from Germany in the Higgins Armory. And it is big, right? So this thing, when I put it on the ground, it comes up to my sternum. I'm 5'10", so this is a big sword, and it weighs close to 4 pounds. Nevertheless, it moves super well. In fact, right, it wants to rotate around a point right around here, right, which is fascinating. I got to fight with it for the first time this past weekend, and this sword just wants to move like swords in Meyer's 1570 manuscript do, and that's right when this sword was made. This thing's really interesting because the thickest point is here below the hilt, where it is 3/4 of a centimeter thick, so 0.74 centimeters thick. And the end of this thing out here is 0.06 centimeters thick, right? So it is just over 1/2 mil thick, which means it's essentially sharp out here. And that taper, right, from being very thick to very thin, starts right away, but it really accelerates when you get into what we call the weak of the blade, right? So it is extremely flexible for the last third of the blade. And you can see that the point of optimal percussion is way out here on this thing, which is where it is on the original sword. Now, this is very different than swords people use to train in HEMA today for a variety of reasons. One, it's essentially sharp, right, out at the point. Although it's very flexible and it's pretty safe in the thrust, it might cut you. And if you get hewed with it, it's not going to cut you through clothing. But if it hits skin that's not covered, it will definitely cut you. And we need to remember that this was part of the German game of the 16th century, right? Was unarmored, kind of showy combat at feck schools and games and public squares where you were trying to get your opponent to bleed from the pate without otherwise wounding them, right? And I think this is a really good sword for that, with the ways that it moves. It just wants to give these little big whines and little cuts out here at the end. This wouldn't hold up very well with this really thin end, even if we put safety aside. With the way that people fight HEMA today, you'd have a lot of broken blades right here, right? It's just too thin for the way that people clash in modern HEMA armor, right? If you didn't have any gloves or any helmet on, right, these swords, I think, wouldn't break as frequently because you'd have to be careful not to kill your friend. This sword is interesting because it's big, like the swords we see in, for example, the Kilmarozzo's manuscripts, which are roughly contemporaneous with this German tradition. But it's after longswords real height of popularity as a weapon. Right, so these are pretty late, really big, and for playing a specialized game. I've got a couple other things to show you that really contrast with this. First of all, here is just one of our regular Fechterspiel training longswords, right? So this is about 1/2 centimeter thick at its thickest point. So that is 50% thicker at its thicker point. And the end out here is more like 2 mils, right? So it's flexible, but it's not going to cut you. And it tapers in a different way, right? This sword wants to move around a point about here, right, a little closer to the hilt, and it is, I would say, a little bit, it behaves more like a sharp longsword from, let's say, the late 15th century to early 16th century. So this one, initially, we based on the fetters that are in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which are shorter than the Higgins one, and maybe a bit earlier, maybe not. We'd have to take a look. But this sword really behaves a lot like something like this, right? Which is our Dur longsword. The weight on them is quite similar. The trainer's a little bit heavier, which is, something you generally want with training swords. The lengths of the swords are very similar, right? The balance, the movement, the way they operate is very similar. And I think that we can think of this as a trainer for fighting with a late 15th century longsword, which is a period when the longsword was, a very popular fighting weapon. So this one, the hilt of this sword we based on the woodcut by Albrecht Dürer of A Knight, Death, and the Devil, and with a blade that is very common for that time period. It is a really iconic longsword, and if you train in the German longsword tradition, the Lichtenauer tradition especially, slightly later Lichtenauer tradition, this is something that those sword fighters would have been very comfortable fighting with, right? So the Fechterspiel trainer is a pretty good analog for this kind of longsword. A different trainer that we've made, that we continue to make, but it's one that we don't make quite as many of, is our Spade de Zhogo. I'll show you that. So this, the Spade de Zhogo, isn't what we'd call a fetter. I'd say that this is a training longsword, a blunt longsword, right? It doesn't have a shield on it. It is a bit more rigid than the Fechterspiel. It's got this nice faceted octagonal pommel, straight guard. This one we based on the illustrations in Fiore della Berri's fighting manuals. So Italian 14th century sword fighting, which shows a smaller sword with a shorter grip, right? It's very thrusty, a lot of half swording in armor and out. So this sword is an analog for something like a Type 15 longsword from the 14th century, right? So this is our German branch sword. It's a Type 15 with a rigid, very pointed blade. This is a highly ornate version. Our Black Prince sword would be another example of a knightly longsword, hand and a half sword that can be used perfectly well in one hand, but that if you were on foot, you would probably use it in two. That Spade de Zhogo has really similar dimensions. emulate to this sword, right? The grip's a tiny bit longer, but it's right within that same historical range. The blades are about the same length. So, the reason I wanted to show you all this stuff is that if you're training a particular kind of martial art, a particular kind of fighting style, there are a wide range of different training tools. Some of which, like the Higgins trainer, which I think is perfect for Joachim Meyer's work, probably wouldn't be appropriate for modern HEMA because the thing they were doing was different. Other swords, like the Spade de Zhogo, right, would be highly appropriate for people doing fiore, harness fechten, armored combat work, or in and out of armor. And the true Federschwerts, like our Fechterspiel, right, are from a really specific time period in very late medieval, early Renaissance Germany, when a bunch of these training traditions exist. So you have a wide range of things to choose from. That Higgins sword, I'm not making those production. If you're interested in one, you can drop us an email and get you a quote. It's just kind of a fun research project to see what they're like. But yeah, show and tell. Hope you liked seeing some swords and my thoughts on these. See you next time.